Thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar today on decarbonizing the electricity grid. We are recording the presentation so that others may follow up and listen later on. It'll be posted later today or tomorrow on our YouTube channel. My name is Louise Comeau, and I'm the Director of Climate Change and Energy Solutions at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. For those of you who know us, we've got a pretty active program here in the province through Conservation Council on electricity issues and climate change. Much of the work we do is in collaboration with environmental groups, think tanks, allies across Canada who also want to see progress on climate change. And that includes a very strong partnership with the Pembina Institute. So we're pretty excited today about our presentation, and I'll introduce our speakers today. I also wanted to say in the context of our commitment to nurturing our Indigenous relations, I wanted to say something less about territorial acknowledgements, but more about the work that we're trying to do. And wanted to kind of note that one of the ways that we are doing the work of building our Indigenous relationships is that we endorse the call by the Indigenous Climate Action team to not use nature-based climate solutions for purposes of offsets, but rather to use that opportunity for Indigenous management and conservation. And so I just wanted to point that out, that for me personally, land acknowledgements isn't getting me as far as I want to go. It's about how do I nurture that relationship and show allyship. I'll now just move quickly to our two speakers. What we'll do is our speakers will speak, obviously, will do their presentations. We're thinking we'll let them both do the presentations in one go. And so if you feel like you need a break or a breath, or that something's being said you don't understand, please use the chat function to raise any questions that you have, to ask for clarification. I'll be monitoring those comments and questions. Once the two presentations are done, we'll open it up, and we're really hoping that we have a good 20 minutes or so for engagement and conversation. Secondly, I would say that today's presentations are happening in the context of a very fluid situation. Only last week we learned about the decision by the federal government to move forward on ensuring New Brunswick phases coal out by 2030. So our presentations today, I think, are very timely and important. Binnu Jeyakumar is the Director of Clean Energy at the Pembina Institute, and she will talk about the work that Pembina does. But if you do any work on energy and climate change issues in Canada, you should know, I believe, the work that Pembina does, very, very important contributors to the discourse in Canada. Her portfolio includes managing the phase out of coal power, integrating renewables, and modernizing the grid. And like many of the colleagues I work with, is a very experienced engineer. Binnu is going to talk about a report that she's led around Coal to Clean, Canada's progress toward phasing out coal power, so a bit of a report card and overview of the national situation. Then we'll hand it over to Jan Gorski, who's the Senior Analyst at the Pembina Institute, working on climate and energy issues across Canada. He leads the methane policy file and has experience working with governments, industry, and other stakeholders. Jan is going to present on the economics of clean energy portfolios in Atlantic Canada, and you're actually getting a sneak peek today into Jan's work, as that report is not yet released. So with all of that exciting background, why don't I hand it over to Binnu to start the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Louise, for that introduction. Yeah, let's dive right into it. Like Louise said, I'm going to be presenting on the work that Pembina has done on tracking how Canada has done so far on phasing out coal and starting to progress towards clean. And it'll tie in nicely with Jan's work, which then looks at what's next for New Brunswick in particular. Just a bit of introduction for those of you who may not know about the Pembina Institute. We are a nonprofit charitable think tank, and we're working to advance a clean energy future for Canada, much like CCNB, and similarly in a manner that supports the economy as well as local communities. And our approach sort of has three prongs, and I've put some examples of some of the work we've done so far. We do a lot of research. Everything is research-based. We do grid modeling, looking at different best practices across different jurisdictions for policies. We've done a lot of that, especially in Western Canada, but then also nationally. We also do a lot of convening around tough issues. So one of the workshops we did was on wind energy in Alberta, looking at what are the challenges for local communities, both from an economic and viewpoint perspective. And we also work closely with government and industry. That wind workshop, actually, we did it with Capital Power. And all of these efforts combined are aimed at pushing for practical energy policies that can enable transition to a clean energy economy in a manner that's cost effective and equitable at the same time. So before I start on Canada's story, I want to give a bit of global perspective on what is driving the change in the electricity sector. And I want to start with the climate imperative. So this slide here is from the International Energy Agency. I'm sure many of you have read that report, but this really stands out for me. It's basically the milestones they set in place for the world to have a chance at staying under 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures. And there are two particular milestones for the electricity sector I wanted to point out. One is that advanced economies should be phasing out coal by 2030. And good news is Canada's on track for that. And as Louise said, now New Brunswick also has a mandate for that. And then the other is not too far off, 2035, to have a net zero grid in all advanced economies. So that would include Canada. And again, we have a national target for that. So that's good news. But yeah, so this is part of what's driving the decisions. The other element is economics. So about 42% of coal plants worldwide are currently running at a loss, and that percentage keeps increasing. This graph here actually compares the cost of running existing coal plants versus new renewables. So the percentage you see shows that in each of these countries, how much percent of their coal plants right now are more expensive to continue running the existing coal plants than actually building new renewable capacity. And what the dots say is that by 2030, new renewables are going to be cheaper than running existing coal plants in all jurisdictions under all market conditions. So that's the challenging economics up ahead for coal. And this, I'm talking about coal without CCS. And if you add CCS on top of that, that's going to be even more expensive. And then the last one I wanted to talk about was health impacts. And if you look at government policies in many countries, including Canada's, a lot of it has been driven by the negative impacts of coal. Coal is easily the most polluting of the major generation technologies that we have running right now. And so just to give you a sense of what the impact is, we did some analysis for Alberta, and we found that coal plants were responsible for about 92 premature deaths per year. These are numbers from 2015. And since most of our audience is from New Brunswick, we also have some analysis courtesy of CCNB here, looking at what the air quality is like in different parts of New Brunswick. And these are annual emissions you see for particulate matter 2.5. And they all fall under the WHO standard for, that was actually until this year, 10 micrograms or picograms per meter cubed. But the new WHO standard, WHO standard, is actually 5. So you'll see there are parts of New Brunswick that now exceed the recommended annual WHO standard. So this is something to keep an eye out for, looking at different developments in New Brunswick, but also particularly for coal. So So given the economics, the climate imperative, and the health impacts, we're actually starting to see a lot of progress in countries worldwide. In particular, I wanted to point out the top 10 coal generating countries in the world now all have a net zero pledge. Some of them for 2050 and understandably some of them beyond that. And there's a lot of pressure for them to bring those pledges to 2050. Some of these jurisdictions like the US actually have a 2035 net zero grid target as well. So there is a lot of progress happening on this. And this is, building off the momentum from COP26. It's definitely difficult in a lot of these jurisdictions, but they are stepping up. For example, India is going to be building 500 gigawatts of renewables and coming up to 50% of renewable capacity by 2030. So these are things that exceed Canada's grid by 4 to 5 times. In Canada also, we're seeing some momentum. So there are oil and gas companies, utilities, banks that are starting to put forward net zero targets. In the electricity sector, Ontario Power Generation, TransAlta, Capital Power have all talked about net zero goals. And I thought this was interesting, like even in the impacted sector. So Iron and Earth did a survey and they found that 61% of workers in oil and gas and coal industry support a transition to a net zero economy. So the momentum is building, and Canada has a good news story actually to tell on coal by and large. Our story actually begins in 2007 when Ontario declared through a multi-party consensus actually that it would start phasing out coal. Back in 2007, this was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to announce this. In 2012, our federal government, under the Harper administration, put forward a coal phase-out regulation. And under the system they had established, coal plants would continue to operate for about 50 years of their life, which would mean that the last coal plant in Canada would have been shut down in 2061. This was the situation in 2012. In 2014, Ontario actually completed its coal phase out, resulting in the single largest GHG reduction in North America at that time. Then a snapshot of 2015. So by now, you'll see Ontario had phased out its coal, and we have basically 4 remaining provinces with coal: Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And you'll see these are also the blue bars are their GHG intensity for their grid. And so you'll see these are also the dirtiest electricity grids in Canada. But progress continues to being made. This shows the percent of coal generation in the different coal owning provinces. And you'll see there's been a steady decline. And in particular, if you look at from 2015 onwards, the steepest decline has been for Alberta. I want to speak a little bit about what happened in Alberta. So where we started, like I said, in 2012, when the Harper coal regulations were put in place, Alberta was the province that would have seen the last coal plant, because we built the last coal plant in Canada. We would have seen coal phased out in 2061. Right now, the plan of Alberta Coal Utilities is to phase out coal by 2023. That's almost a 4-decade leap forward. And another good news story, actually, just from 2 weeks ago, Heartland Generation became the second major Canadian utility after OPG to phase out coal. So they burnt their last lump of coal just 2 weeks ago in Alberta. So it's happening really fast. And what contributed to this? So I think there's sort of like 3 main things, actually. One was we had a very clear signal for coal phase out. So in Alberta, back in 2015, the Alberta government said that they would phase out coal by 2030 and entered into agreements with the coal companies. And so that was a pretty clear signal for coal companies to start looking at their books again about what the economics of coal was and starting to look at what alternatives existed for them. On top of that, we also have really effective carbon pricing in Alberta. So every jurisdiction right now has slightly different variations of carbon pricing, despite having a federal standard. In Alberta, we've got a standard of 370 grams per megawatt hour. And that's basically a new gas plant would meet that. So there's no way any coal plant can meet that standard without having CCUS. So any emissions beyond that standard, you have to pay for. And as you know, the carbon price is increasing. So this really puts pressure on coal. And what we found was actually, as soon as we had carbon pricing implemented in Alberta, this new carbon pricing scheme, the generation from coal actually dropped right away because it couldn't compete with natural gas. Interestingly, so that led to increased natural gas generation, and I'll get to that in a bit. But this was another big piece of the changing business case for coal in Alberta. And obviously what happened in Alberta, we do have access to a lot of cheap gas. And so a lot of companies are actually converting their coal units to burn gas. I mean, some of them are looking at CCUS as an option, also looking at, there is massive investments happening in renewables and storage in Alberta too, but a lot of this is being facilitated because we can convert to gas. And this comes with its own risks to climate in particular and as stranded assets. But one thing that is working in our favor is there is a federal regulation that puts a limit on these converted coal to gas units. So the dirtier they are, the shorter the lifespan they can actually operate under the coal regulation. So that gives a little bit of limiting forces for the gas developments. But this is definitely still a risk. The one thing I wanted to point out also, I think that Alberta did well, was when we implemented the new carbon price, we also set aside just transition funds to be directed from the revenues of the carbon price to go to workers and communities to support the impacted coal workers and communities so that they could transition to new jobs and look for new revenue and business opportunities. I want to spend a couple minutes on New Brunswick before I hand it over to Jan. So I think this is old news for you folks. As you know, there's this one plant in New Brunswick. And as Louise mentioned, most recently, the federal government actually rejected New Brunswick's plan to have an equivalency agreement, which would have meant that Belledune would have continued to operate past 2030. So right now, Belledune's now got a 2030 phase out timeline as well. This is just a few days ago, so we'll still look to see what the plans mean. But this is good news for us because Belledune is the second largest emitter for GHGs in New Brunswick. So having this plant, the emissions go away from this plant will be a pretty big deal for New Brunswick in terms of its GHG emissions. If you look at all the sectors in New Brunswick, electricity is like a close third. It's almost close to oil and gas in New Brunswick in terms of the emissions. So addressing New Brunswick as Belledune as one of the largest GHG emitters would be a pretty big deal for New Brunswick and a pretty big win for climate and health. And yeah, so these were some of the scenarios we were looking at Pembina and what the future of New Brunswick's coal could be like. And the red dotted line there, looking at accelerated transition, would be the most ideal, where you actually have a cap that follows the equivalency agreement the New Brunswick government proposed, and then that goes to 0 at 2030. The other option is that we keep it at current levels, and then it drops significantly to 0 by 2030. So depending on the option New Brunswick takes, we could be, this is this last red bar here, we could be looking at GHG emissions of between 21.5 to 26 between the years of 2020 and 2045. So this is a pretty significant reduction in megatons from business as usual. You know, we could be looking at over 30 megaton productions. So that's pretty good news for New Brunswick. But along with the rest of Canada, we do have some other risks that come, like I mentioned this with the story of Alberta. In Canada, also, it's the same thing. As coal comes down, and we are now on track across Canada to retire coal or emissions from coal by 2030. And then, but what we see is a doubling of GHG emissions or gas emissions because of increased gas capacity replacing coal, as well as to make up for some of the increased demand for electricity from electrification. And so what we think needs to happen is we need to have provinces commit to 2035 net zero grid goals so that they can manage the gas risk. Not saying no new gas at all, but manage it in a way so that we can reach 2035 net zero grid and convert the national goal into provincial plans. We need effective carbon pricing, similar to what we had in Alberta, so that it actually creates a good business case for utilities to step away from coal and invest in clean energy technologies. We need investments in infrastructure to interties, like the Atlantic Loop, are going to be a big component of having a low-cost decarbonized grid. We also need regulatory reform. The rules of the market are very antiquated now. They were built for coal and gas plants. We need to make sure they're updated so we can actually take advantage of clean energy technologies and some of the features that Jan is going to talk about, and help the grid operate in a low cost and reliable manner. And obviously, we also need to be spending resources on making sure communities and workers are supported and that they actually have a voice at the table when we are talking about these energy transition issues. So I will wrap it up there. Louise, I'll hand it to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Binnu. That was awesome. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, but I have a feeling that some of them will be answered in Jan's presentation. One question wanted to know, there was quite a dip from Nova Scotia in 2001, and wondered if we knew where that came from. And I wondered if Stephen Thomas could answer that maybe in the chat. And then Sam Arnold asked about Pembina's view on SMRs. And maybe we can hold that one until we get through Jan's presentation. How's that? Okay, over to you, Jan. Don't forget.
You're just muted there, bud.
Oh, good call. Hi, everyone. Jan Gorski here. Thanks, Louise, for the introduction, and thanks, Binnu, for kicking us off. So I'll be doing the next part, which is looking at, as we phase out coal, what's the role for clean energy resources? And Binnu, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Binnu, oh, there we go. Yep, and we can move on to the next slide. So on the road to net zero by 2050, as Binnu mentioned, the electricity sector is the first one that needs to meet net zero, and Canada's goal right now is 2035, so that's really what we're aiming for. And on this path, we're going to need new sources of electricity, both to meet the demand as coal is phased out in New Brunswick, and also to meet the demand of new sectors as new sectors electrify, especially transport, building heat, and industry. We've seen a lot of momentum in terms of more electricity in these sectors to come in the next decade. And the other important piece, which again Binnu alluded to, was all the interest in the Atlantic Loop, which is a transmission network between the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And I'll be talking a bit more about that later. The next slide, please. So the question that we looked at here was, can a portfolio of clean energy resources that don't have any carbon emissions provide the same reliable source of electricity as a gas plant or a small modular nuclear reactor? So we looked at 3 different scenarios. We compared clean portfolios to a combined cycle gas plant, which provides the steady kind of baseload power. We compared it to a peaker gas plant, which really provides electricity in those hours of peak demand. And finally, we looked at the comparison with small modular nuclear reactors, because this is something that the New Brunswick government is really interested in and is putting some resources towards. So you're probably thinking, what is a clean energy portfolio? There's a whole variety of clean energy resources. We only looked at a subset of these. The ones that we included were wind power, solar power, battery energy storage, energy efficiency, demand response, and imported hydropower. So most of these, I imagine you guys understand. The one that I'll talk a little bit about and explain is demand response. Demand response is, these are programs that give incentives to customers to shift when they use electricity. So to shift it from times of peak demand to times when electricity isn't being used as much and when you don't have to rely on these peaker plants as much. And we'll delve into this a little more later. So we conducted a study using a model that was developed by the Rocky Mountain Institute, and they did a lot of the modeling effort. And the comparison that we did was for building a new plant in 2030 in New Brunswick. And it was really for building the next plant. So we didn't do a systems level analysis of, can you replace all existing gas plants, or do all future gas plants need to be, or can they all be replaced with clean portfolios? We looked at the next plant that you build, whether it's a combined cycle gas plant, a peaker gas plant, or a small modular nuclear reactor. Can the services that it provides be replaced, or be replaced with a clean energy portfolio? And the criteria that we looked at was, can the clean portfolio provide the same amount of energy in a month? Can it provide the same reliability? So in the top 50 hours in a year of peak demand, is that clean portfolio available to generate electricity? And finally, flexibility. Can that plant turn on and off as quickly as a gas plant or small modular reactor? And next slide. So the results of the study were, yes, clean energy portfolios can, for all the scenarios we looked at, provide the same services at a lower cost than the gas plants. The first chart we have here shows the comparison for combined cycle plants. And you can see that the clean portfolio is almost half the price in terms of the cost of energy over the lifetime of the plant compared to a gas plant. And for a combined cycle plant, a lot of that energy in the clean portfolio comes from wind. Next slide, please, Binnu. Again, for a gas peaker plant, clean portfolios, again, provide a lower cost of energy, but you can see that the mix is different. There's a lot more reliance on battery storage because these peaker plants, they don't run very often. They're only used seldomly, but they need to be available at very specific times. And so there's a lot of reliance on battery storage, which is able to provide energy when it's needed. Next slide, please. Oh, the news already ahead of me. And the final comparison was for small modular reactors. And again, we see that clean portfolios win out. And for the small modular reactor, we assumed that it basically operated in a similar manner to the current nuclear plant. So very high capacity factors. It's running most of the times, low downtime. And we see that the optimal clean portfolio is a pretty healthy mix of wind and solar and batteries and demand response as well. So across all these scenarios, clean portfolios really won out. And again, I want to mention that this wasn't a systems level analysis. This wasn't a how do we get to net zero. But one thing I want to point out is that for the combined cycle scenario, we modeled a gas plant that basically meets the size and operating characteristics of the existing coal plant. So in essence, this scenario looks at, once you shut down the Belledune coal plant, what is the most feasible option for replacing it? And so the answer was that it's a mix of clean energy portfolios and not a gas plant. All right, next slide, please, Binnu. So those are the results. Now I want to get into some of the factors that we're seeing that are really driving the results in favor of clean portfolios. One thing that I mentioned earlier is imported hydro. You'll notice that you didn't actually see imported hydro show up in the results. And that's because we examined the role of imported hydro, but what we found was that clean portfolios are cheaper than gas plants and small modular reactors, even without that hydro resource. If you add that hydro resource in, the cost of the clean portfolio comes down even further. So this is important because there's a lot of interest in this Atlantic Loop transmission network. The federal government has expressed interest in it. The major provinces have all committed to collaborate to see how they can move it forward. And it really becomes, it can help with the clean portfolios at the next plant, when you're looking at the next plant that's being built. But where it's really crucial is when we start talking about net zero. How do we actually create a zero emissions grid? That's where the Atlantic Loop becomes important. And the role that it can play there is that it enables more wind and solar. As you really try to remove all the carbon emissions from the grid, you're going to need to build up more and more wind and solar, and you start to just reach some of these limits, and that's where hydro plays a role, because it can fill the gaps when you don't have wind or you don't have solar power. Next slide, please. Another key driver is the declining cost of renewables. In the last 10 years, the cost of wind and solar and energy storage has really come down tremendously, and we expect these to continue to fall in the next decades. So this has really been a pretty big driver. And we see here the cost of wind and solar projected based on our calculations in New Brunswick. And what I want to point out here is that we're really at this inflection point right now. So we're at this point where solar and wind are quite comparable in terms of cost, and we expect the solar to actually outcompete wind in the next 5 years or so. Next slide, please. Another driver for clean portfolios is that we're gaining more experience with energy efficiency and demand response programs. So both New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have these programs in place, and many other provinces in Canada do as well. So we're gaining experience with how to run them, how to provide incentives properly, and getting some idea of what contribution they can have. And when we're talking about energy efficiency, we're talking about upgrading to energy efficient lighting, switching to heat pumps, which are more efficient way of heating, and insulating buildings to reduce the amount of energy that's actually needed to heat them. On the demand response side, two promising technologies are smart thermostats, which basically allow you to shift when you heat your home to kind of align so that you're doing it outside of peak hours, and then storing heat using hot water tanks as an energy storage device. All right, next slide, please. One of the big barriers to natural gas in the Atlantic provinces is that there's a lot of infrastructure that's needed. So if we want to build out more gas plants, we'll need either pipelines or LNG terminals to bring that gas into the province. So as we look towards how to replace coal power and how to meet net zero, we really need to evaluate what the role of gas is, because there's this risk of stranded assets, and there's a need to build new infrastructure to enable that gas. The cost of natural gas is also quite volatile. In the last 5 years, what we've seen is the gas prices have been at historic lows, and now we're seeing them starting to rise as demand begins to outpace supply. And so we're seeing these rapidly rising gas prices, which are expected to keep going up in the winter as we use more and more gas for heating. Next slide, please. For small modular reactors, the biggest barrier is that this technology simply isn't commercial yet. So you can't go out and buy a small modular nuclear reactor right now. So there's uncertainty both with the technology and with how much it's going to cost. We looked at a range of cost scenarios for small modular reactors, and we found that for all the scenarios we considered, clean portfolios were actually cheaper. Next slide, please. Another variable is carbon pricing. So New Brunswick currently has a fairly weak carbon pricing system for large industrial emitters that doesn't apply significant costs to them. But if the federal carbon pricing system were to apply in New Brunswick, the cost of carbon for gas plants would go up significantly. And this is something that is very much possible as the federal government reevaluates whether provincial carbon pricing systems are meeting the minimum thresholds that is required by the federal system. So this graph here shows if the federal carbon pricing system were to apply to a combined cycle gas plant in New Brunswick, you can see that the cost of gas on a $1 per megawatt hour basis would go up quite a bit. It's almost 50% more. This impact is quite a bit lower for peaker gas plants simply because they're not used as often. So the biggest impact is on combined cycle. And the reason why carbon pricing is important is because it represents the real cost of climate change. And this is something that we've seen in BC this year, both with the heat waves this summer and with recent flooding events. Climate change has real costs to our society and to our community. Next slide, please. One of the concerns with renewable energy technologies, wind and solar, is around ancillary services. And I'm going to try and explain this because it's a somewhat technical concept. But these are kind of the basic needs of the grid. So any electricity generation resource needs to be able to meet these basic requirements of the grid, including voltage, frequency, ramping. I won't get into what all of those mean, but in the past, there's been concerns about whether renewables can actually provide those basic services. And the technology has really advanced quite a bit in the last couple of years. And there's been studies, especially in the US, that have shown that there are solutions to these issues and that it's really not as big of a concern as it's sometimes been made out to be. And that there are ways to integrate renewables into the grid and have them meet these basic grid requirements. And next slide. So to wrap up, what we've seen is that portfolios of clean energy resources can provide a reliable, affordable, and clean source of electricity. In most cases, significantly cheaper than the status quo of gas plants or small modular reactors. And these are low emissions. So we haven't even factored in the cost of putting carbon capture on gas plants yet. So these clean portfolios should really be prioritized as we look to phase out coal and how to replace it. One of the recommendations we have, and one of the things we'd like to see, is for New Brunswick to develop an integrated resource plan that fully examines how we can replace coal with the cleanest mix of resources possible. And looks at a variety of scenarios to meet that, but to both include the Atlantic Loop, include imported hydro, but also include these local resources. Because building wind and solar and running energy efficiency and demand response programs in New Brunswick can create local jobs and local economic opportunities. But of course, we do still need to support coal workers through this transition. And lastly, we saw that imported hydro can reduce the cost of these clean energy portfolios. And so we really need to evaluate the role of the Atlantic Loop in meeting the net zero, in helping achieve a net zero grid in New Brunswick. And we need to make progress in making the Atlantic Loop happen, because we know that these big transmission projects, they take time to develop. And if they're going to happen, we need to start solving some of those challenges now and really making progress. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. And I'll pass it back to Louise. We can then open up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. I've read the report a few times and it was like, I just love this presentation. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm going to go through and work a little bit backwards from the questions that have come in. So that I've got one that's a statement. I want to go into Tom McLean's question for a second. Why does this goes back to the table that you had, the slide that you had with the 3 options, combined cycle, SMRs, and the clean portfolio. And the question, the gas peaker, sorry. Question from Tom is, why does the clean replacement stack have, for the combined cycle plant, have more wind than that for the nuclear replacement stack? So,
I'm on mute again. That's a good question. I'd have to dig into the details of the modeling to really be able to answer that. But my sense is the reason why is because a gas plant is only typically predicted to run about half the time, whereas a nuclear reactor is expected to run, 90% of the time, be operational 90% of the time. And so you end up needing, or it enables a broader mix and a broader balance of these clean energy technologies. Whereas if it's only running 50% of the time, the technologies you need are kind of catered to when you need the gas plant.
okay. And if anyone else wants to respond to any of these questions, by all means, we've got other colleagues on the call who also collaborate with us. This work that we do with Pembina includes Ecology Action Center as well as David Suzuki Foundation. So I'm always happy to call on our other colleagues as well. The one statement was, haven't the Europeans been working with renewables, including flexibility, for decades, since the late 80s, Germany, Denmark, etc. Oh, now that moved me forward there. We don't have to look to the US. Yes, that could be true. Do you want to say anything about that, Jan, or Binnu at all? Just wanted that
yeah, I
comment?
can take that. It's very true. In fact, the UK has a goal of operating a completely net zero grid without any gas by 2025, and they're on track for that. Just the ability to do that. So yes, they have been working on it a lot. Honestly, part of this is Canadians, every jurisdiction thinks they are unique. And so we try to find analogies that people can relate to. And so, yeah, like absolutely right. We can learn lessons from Europe. I think there are a lot of similarities between US jurisdictions and Canadian jurisdictions, especially in terms of how our markets are set up, the amount of deregulation we may have in different Canadian provinces. There are some analogies with the levels of deregulation in different US states. So those analogies also help us look to that, to US for examples. But yeah, Europe is definitely leading the pack on this.
Great. Listen, I'm going to take a comment from Darren that could help us respond to Tom's question. So Darren from MB Power says, I thought the answer to the question about the wind nuclear gas comparison for wind was that half the energy in the nuclear case was coming from solar. So per megawatt generated, the costs only represent half. And with the gas unit, the wind represents more like 90% of the energy. So it is higher per megawatt hour. I asked the same question to Jan a few weeks ago, and I think that's what he said at the time. So I don't know if I read that to make it clear, but if you want to say anything about that, Jan, before I jump back to this question that Tom also asks. Was any?
Let me try and process this first before I answer it.
Okay, perfect, good. I like that. I like that. Tom's question: what are the pros and cons of having private business build and own generating assets versus having communities, co-ops do it versus centralized power utilities? And of course, that's a great question, given that both of you are located in Alberta, where you have some experience with the private side of it. So I'll just let you, Go for it.
I can start, Tom. I'll tell you right away. I'm not going to be able to give you a comprehensive answer. I mean, this is something you can chat for hours. Yeah, I mean, okay, first on deregulation, right? So centralized power utilities versus IPPs. I think that's interesting to see the progress in Alberta, how quickly utilities were able to respond to carbon pricing and the coal phase out, and shift gears so fast, right? And they did, and I think part of the credit does go to the fact that we have an open wholesale market, which reflects these costs on carbon price right away. And so they were feeling the impact of carbon pricing on their revenue right away, which changed the business case for them. Having said that, I think there is advantages in having centralized power utilities, especially sort of the LSE models in the US, where you have these large vertically integrated utilities that are regulated, and states like California can actually give them a mandate that they then have to follow. They have specific energy efficiency targets. They have renewable procurement targets. Those are things we can't do in a completely deregulated market like Alberta. So I think so those are the advantages, I would say, for vertically integrated utilities that are heavily regulated. You can have more of a state mandate that can get them to shift more rapidly if the state puts forward. And then in that case, then you'd have to have your regulator on your side also, and then be able to put forward really strong mandates to the utilities. The co-op model is, I think, very different. I think it has, a different set of advantages. Like, it is an opportunity for consumers to take part in them. You have a stronger link to what is attractive to citizens. So if you look at where innovations are happening on energy efficiency, on demand side management, where you have like electric water heaters that are controlled by the system operator, those sort of things, we are starting to see a lot of innovation like that happening at the co-op level because they are more engaged with the citizens. But again, that depends with where the co-ops are located and how much activism has been going on around there. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'd say, there's advantages to all of those models. We probably need a mix of that. But in all of those, I think we can say there is the role of, strong government mandates to draw and good policy design to drive action for all those different models. I don't know, Tom, if that answers your question, or if you wanted to add something, Tom, maybe you have some insights to share.
I mean, the one thing I do wonder about, because I see the nimbleness of the different models and the rigidity that I see sometimes here. I also see a lot of government interference that I think gets in NB Power's way. And I really wonder if we can evolve toward a model that includes all three dynamics. Space for community-owned power, space for publicly owned power, space for the private sector. I'm just wondering, if we know of any examples of jurisdictions that have kind of a mixed model. I don't know if that comes off the top of your head. Maybe it's impossible, but I've been struggling with that very dynamic in my own mind as well here.
Yeah, I don't know. It makes me think of places like Colorado, where you have folks like Xcel Energy competing, and you have a lot of community generation also, and they're all doing really well. But I think that's where, Louise, it is important to also have that strong government mandate and the regulator allowing these things to happen. I think that is a key component of success there. They're not going to happen in vacuum. You do need the government incentives and regulatory incentives to make those happen.
Okay. Could I, if folks don't mind, I would like to ask a question of Jan and Binnu if they can respond to it, or if others have more insight. But one of the things that has kind of bubbled to the surface since the federal announcement on Belledune is the idea that some or all of the power at Belledune could be replaced by burning biomass. You know, since that's not in this particular analysis, and I know you folks are expert in so many ways, I just wondered if you had some thoughts on that. I can tell you that, sorry, let me just close that. You know, that you know, when I first talked to some of the management within NB Power at Beldoon years ago about this, you know, their issue was the impact on forests would be devastating if you tried to replace it one for one. But you know, there seems to be some interest in some or all, or you know, we are exporting 400,000 tons of pellets to the Drax plant, which also strikes terror in my heart, in the UK. You know, could we redirect some of that here? And I just wonder, given what we've looked at, and you know, just maybe if you have any thoughts on that, in terms of, especially when I think of the air quality dimensions and so on. But anyway, just throw that out there. Do you have any insights on the biomass side and how we're going to bring that into this conversation?
Louise, I think you are more of an expert on biomass than we are. Pembina hasn't been working on biomass for over a decade now. Yeah, I would just say, I mean, and this was our findings even back then, and I know this is the challenge, continues to be the challenge, is sustainable procurement of the biomass, right? Like, does it actually result in credible GHG reductions? I think that's key, and making sure that supply is there. So that question you're saying about where does our biomass, if it is sustainably sourced, go, and should it go to Drax? And you know, I have to say, like, there is a lot of local opposition for Drax also for investing in biomass, and I think the climate community is definitely skeptical. Pembina currently doesn't have an official position on biomass that's updated, I'd say, but yeah, I think there are a lot of challenges to biomass you have to overcome.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe just to bring the conversation also on what the electricity grid needs, right? I think you also need to look at what are the characteristics of the plants that we are building. From what Jan was saying, what we need are more flexible plants. And maybe I can get to sort of Tom's question on this too. It's becoming more and more clear as we increase electrification, and we know for a fact we need to bring in more renewables, variable renewables onto the grid. What actually helps the grid is having more flexible generation. The ability to ramp up and down is going to be key. So if you have biomass plants or nuclear plants that are base load plants, they are going to become a liability to the system. And you know, we're starting to see that in jurisdictions like Germany, where they pay a lot to actually have coal plants ramp up and down, highly inefficient, highly polluting. But you know, we would have to start looking at solutions like that. So maybe if I can bring it to the SMR question, I think that's what, Tom, you meant by new nuclear. I hope Jan answered some of your questions around the price and the options that exist for alternatives for small modular nuclear reactors. Pembina, again, this is something we are actually doing an analysis on. We're currently doing an LCA on SMRs. And once we have the results for that, we'll be able to speak to it more. We're looking at it both from a GHG perspective, as well as obviously the other impacts of nuclear waste and toxicity that have to be mitigated. But we look forward to sharing those results when they're done. They will be done sometime early in the new year. That's right. Thanks, Louise. That's the life cycle assessment.
Super. Okay, so I don't know if Jan wants to add. Yeah, we're just coming to the very end. I'm just very grateful for your contributions today. Is there, if anyone wants to just, if they have a burning question before I wrap it up and sign us off, by all means. I've seen a couple of comments and so on, and those are great. But if there's any questions, I don't want you to leave without answering those before we wrap it up. And I'll kind of give you a heads up around a couple of other pieces that are coming that we'll be inviting you to in the new year. Okay, I'm just going to look here to see if there was something that came in. Looks good so far. Okay, so let me just say, one of the things that we've talked about here is modeling and analysis. And I think if I were to summarize the key dynamic that Jan and Binnu have talked about, is that there is a short-term play and a longer-term play. That the clean renewable portfolios opportunities are the near-term play and get us to 2030. The longer-term play is the Atlantic Atlantic Loop, and that helps us get to net zero grid by 2035. And there, I think in the discourse, there's too much focus on the Atlantic Loop and not enough on the domestic part of it, the provincial contribution and the opportunities. And I think for us, we see a real opportunity for example, a renewable energy, a green energy hub in the north. There's an awful lot we could do here in the province that is part of that. There was a question about when the second report, the report that Jan talked about, is coming out. I think that's in January. Am I correct, Jan, for the report? Finish analysis in Q1. Yes. So,
yep.
Okay. So Q2. So not till spring.
To clarify, I was talking, I didn't know if Tom was referring to the nuclear one. The SMR results are coming out Q1, Q2, 2022.
Okay. Right. But Jan's.
And Jan, I'll let you speak to your report.
Okay.
Yeah, our report will be coming out in January, early January.
Perfect.
So
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay. So the other thing that we'll be doing shortly is hosting a second webinar, another webinar in January, and it will feature modeling that's been done for the Atlantic by Dave Sawyer and Navius for our group. That work is being led by Ecology Action Center, so they will sponsor that webinar. We'll make sure that you all know about it so that you can attend, but very detailed analysis about our opportunities. And again, very much reinforcing this point that the future is renewable. So we're kind of excited about getting this kind of technical analysis to help us understand our opportunities. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye. I'm not going to shut off things before people have answered comments. And yes, we are all very grateful for your great presentations. Corey will post this to YouTube. Please share far and wide. I know I will be doing so to all the key decision makers in New Brunswick. So once again, thank you very, very much. Fantastic presentations. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.